Now, Paul tells the Philippians in chapter 2, verses 19 to 24, that he hopes to send Timothy. It sounds like it's echoing. Is it echoing to you guys? Okay, so I don't know where the balance is, Rich. It sounds like it's echoing. I'm having, okay, he's working on it. I got the brain trust on it. But he says in 2:19 to 24 that he hopes to send Timothy to them soon. But as he says in 2:25 to 30, yes, he's sending Epaphroditus back to them now. So Epaphroditus will be coming back to them with the letter. And he makes clear that that was his decision to send Epaphroditus back. And he explains that he's doing so because Epaphroditus was longing for all of them. And also he was in anguish because they had heard of his grave illness. So it bothered him that they knew, yeah, this thing's ringing or something. So I see people signaling me to turn it down. So however that works. All right, so it'll be, we're just going to ice you out, Lois. But he says, you know, Epaphroditus, when they learned that he was so ill, that bothered Epaphroditus. And Paul, he urges them to welcome Epaphroditus in the Lord, welcome him back as a brother in Christ. Still want it lower? Still too loud, I'm seeing. And he says to do that with all joy. All right, sounds better now. I'm getting some thumbs up there. He says to do it with all joy. There was to be no disappointment, no resentment that Epaphroditus had returned prematurely before. You know, Paul is still there. Whatever they had envisioned, he sent him back. So he says you're to welcome him back and receive him with all joy. And because he had served with distinction, he was an honor to the church in Philippi. So don't be harboring some kind of resentment against him. And even more, he says they're to hold Epaphroditus and all those like him in high esteem. He says he risked his life for the cause of Christ. So he's somebody who's worthy of honor. And when we ended last week, I was encouraging us to be willing to honor such faithful and sacrificial servants in the church today. And I said there's some reluctance to do that. We tend to be afraid of honoring somebody because we say he's just a man or just a woman or something like that. And that's true. But there are people who have lived sacrificial lives in the cause of Christ and for that reason deserve honor. They're worthy of honor. And it's a good thing to do that. Now in chapter 3, Paul turns his attention to a theological threat to the Philippians' faith. He says in chapter 3, 1 to 4, the first part of 4, he says, "And so, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you is not troublesome for me, but a safeguard for you. Beware of the dogs. Beware of the evil workman. Beware of the mutilation group. For we are the circumcision, the ones who serve in the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and do not have confidence in the flesh, though I myself might have confidence in the flesh also." Now verse 1, it's a transition in which Paul, he urges them to rejoice in the Lord. And the opening phrase there, it's commonly, probably in your translation, it is commonly translated finally. And here I think it's better translated, along with Peter O'Brien and a number of other people. Here I think it's better translated, "and so," suggesting a connection with what went before. It's a transitional statement. It's a bridge between what went before and what's to follow. See, the paragraphs that go before, they provide joyful news. Namely, that Epaphroditus has returned after praiseworthy service, that he hopes to send Timothy soon, and that he's confident that he will visit soon. So all of those things are bases or grounds for rejoicing. And then the exhortation to rejoice, it's linked to what follows. It's linked to what follows in that the Judaizers threatened to rob them of their joy by denying that they were saved. So you see its functions. Here's reasons for joy, and so rejoice in the Lord, both because of what I've just said and because of the threat that is being posed to your joy by these people who are telling you that you're not really saved. So that's how I see that as a transition. Then he says to write the same things that he previously taught them, to remind them of his former teaching. And you see it's clearly his former teaching in chapter 3, verse 18. He says it's not a bother for him. It's not something that he is reluctant to do or hesitant to do. Rather, it's a safeguard for them. It's something that protects them against the theological danger that's posed by the false teaching of the Judaizers. So he says it's not something I'm hesitant or reluctant to do. It's not troublesome for me to do it. It's a safeguard for you because you are being threatened by what is being taught to you here. And Paul warns the Philippians about the Judaizers in very strong terms. Right? He says, beware of the dogs. Beware of the evil workmen. Beware of the mutilation group. Now let me say just a little word as a little aside about the Judaizers. When we looked at Galatians, I explained about the Judaizers. But the Judaizers, they were Jewish believers in Christ. So they're believers in Christ, Jewish believers, who rejected the fact that the Mosaic covenant had been rendered obsolete. They clung to that covenant. They clung to it as an ongoing and operative covenant, which led them then to insist that Christians must live according to the Mosaic law in order to be saved. This wasn't some matter of just something that I just wanted to know. No, this covenant is operative. You must live according to the Mosaic law in order to be saved. You see that put most starkly in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 to 5, where they're saying, unless you're circumcised, meaning unless you accept the idea that you must come under the Mosaic law, you cannot be saved. And so that's what they were doing. And this was a damning doctrine. It is heretical. Because, as I will explain momentarily, it implicitly made works rather than faith in Christ the basis of one's relationship with God. Now, the truth of the matter is that Christ's death, his resurrection, and his ascension brought to completion the institution of the new covenant. So Christ ushered in the new covenant, and by insisting that Christians submit to the law of the old covenant in order to be saved, the Judaizers were forcing Christians, they were forcing them to choose to relate to God on the terms of that obsolete covenant instead of on the terms of the new covenant. That's what they were doing. They clung to that and said, no, you must live like an old covenant Jew. You must be under the Mosaic law because that covenant is still in effect. So you have to live that way. And as Paul makes clear in Galatians chapter 5, verses 2 to 4, it is an either or choice. It's either or. You got to go one or the other. It is an election. It is an exclusive election. You pick that way or you pick the other way. And you see what he says in Galatians 5, 2 to 4. He says, listen. Now this is writing to the Galatians who are being threatened by Judaizers. He says, I, Paul, say to you. He's writing to Christians. I, Paul, say to you that if you get circumcised, now he doesn't simply mean if you get circumcised for some ancillary reason, like Paul would circumcise Timothy for evangelistic reasons. He's saying if you submit to the Judaizers' claim that you must come under the Mosaic law in order to be saved. In other words, if you get circumcised in that context, that's the significance of it. So he says that I say to you that if you get circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you at all. You got to pick. If you're going to buy the Judaizers what they're selling, then Christ will be of no benefit to you at all. And I testify again to every man who gets circumcised that he is a debtor. He is obligated to obey the whole law. You who seek to be pronounced righteous by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. So they were Christians. He says if you come in and swallow what the Judaizers are saying, you will have alienated yourself from Christ. You see, it is a damning doctrine. The old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, cannot be forced onto the new. Or to put it differently, the new cannot be forced into the form of the old. That was Jesus' point in Mark chapter 2, 21 to 22, and in Matthew 9, 16 and 17, Luke 5, 36 and 37, where he said that no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment or pours new wine into old wineskins. As Scott McKnight says in his commentary on Galatians, McKnight says, if we use the categories, referring to Galatians chapter 3, 19 to 25, the Galatians' departure was a decision to live in BC days when the AD days had arrived. It was a decision to recede back into the days of Moses and to reject the epic, altering revelation of Christ. You see, in Christ, the page of salvation history has turned. The planned obsolescence of the Mosaic covenant has come to pass. And so it's significant. Thomas Schreiner, he says similarly, he says the Galatians were turning the clock back in salvation history by submitting to circumcision in the Mosaic law. Since Jesus had been raised from the dead, believers are no longer under the Mosaic covenant. So in choosing to relate to God under the obsolete Mosaic covenant, when they did that, one chose to relate to God under a covenant in which the animal sacrifices prescribed for forgiveness were no longer recognized. They were no longer recognized. You see, the forgiveness that God had provided in association with those animal sacrifices, that forgiveness was based on, was underwritten by the fact Christ was coming. You see, those things, those animal sacrifices were not atoning in themselves. They were not inherently atoning. For as the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Now, with Christ's appearance in history, his offering of himself as the perfect and true sacrifice, those shadow sacrifices were no longer valid. They were no longer linked to forgiveness. The reality of Christ has now appeared. And that means that one who chooses to relate to God under the old covenant is left with what? Is left with bare law. Is left only with the set of commands. One is under the commands of the covenant, but without any applicable sacrifice for one's inevitable violations of those commands. So you've now entered into something that is a strictly legal thing, and the mercy element that had been provided is no longer valid. So now when you come under, you are obligated to obey all the law or you're toast. Because the mercy element, the sacrifices, are no longer valid. And so you see how this works. You see, that leaves one dependent then necessarily. If you choose this column, then you are necessarily dependent on your own works for salvation. You are dependent on obeying completely for salvation. And that contradicts and it nullifies Christ's saving work. That's what's going on. That's what's going on. You see, the key is the Christ-effected change of covenants. Douglas Moo, in his commentary on Galatians, Moo says, Paul assumes in his argument in the letter that the sacrifice of Christ has rendered the Old Testament provisions for atonement null and void. You see, they were based on his coming. It was on credit, so to speak. But now that he's appeared, the true, efficacious sacrifice, those shadows no longer have any meaning. They're no longer valid. So he says, the Old Testament provision for atonement, null and void. In the time after Christ, then, one is faced with two and only two options. Find justification in Christ by faith, or find justification through the law, a justification that can now, apart from the provision of sacrifice, be secured only by doing all the law all the time. You see, you've now brought yourself into a true works righteousness situation. And since you're not going to do that, you have basically brought yourself into damnation. And so this is why Paul is so distressed about this, why it's so significant. That's why it's heretical, it's damning. All right, so not only did some Jews distort the Mosaic law into work salvation during the time of the Old Covenant, when the Old Covenant was operative, when it was in effect, you still had some Jews then who warped it and twisted it into a work salvation. That's not the design of the Old Covenant. All salvation always is by grace through faith. But you do have people today, as you had then under the Old Covenant, who will take that and they will twist it and start to think and to say and to indicate that my standing before God really is based on my achievement. It is based on my personal righteousness. You had Jews in the Old Covenant do that, but it was a distortion then, as it is a distortion under the New Covenant. But what happens, see, when the Old Covenant passes, so you had some Jews under the Old Covenant, when the Old Covenant was still operative, you had some Jews who twisted the Mosaic law into a works righteousness. But with the passing of the Old Covenant, you have Jews in the time of the New Covenant, in effect, doing the same thing by insisting that Christians relate to God under the Old Covenant without the benefit of the now superseded animal sacrifices. So in effect, they're doing the same thing. They are leaving people on their own, you see, to earn their standing before God, which we know is impossible. So that left them with only their works, only their obedience on which to stand before God. And that's no place to be. Right? That's no place to be. Now, as I have explained ad nauseum in different classes I have taught, the obsolescence of the Mosaic covenant does not mean that Christians are without specific moral obligations, that they are without divine commands. Commands Do's and don'ts are all over the New Testament. Rather, the obsolescence of the Mosaic covenant, it means that that set of commands, that package, that body, that unit of commands, that are part of the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Law. We have this pact, and embedded in that pact are many commands. And that set of commands, that is the Mosaic Law, that ceased to be binding. But many of the individual commands that were included in that set, those commands that are reflective of the eternal or the universal moral desires of God, they have an ongoing or a renewed applicability in the new covenant. And indeed, they find their full expression in the new covenant. So as I've said before, there were sins before the Mosaic Law, even though they were sins of the heart, and I've talked about this. And some of those things are then incorporated, those universal moral desires are incorporated in the Mosaic Law, also with some things that are peculiarly covenantal, peculiarly related to Israel's mission. So you have this set. Now there are things there that continue, or as I say, find their full expression, or they have a renewed applicability. And you see that all over the New Testament. These things that are included in the Mosaic Law that are still cited and referred to. Now I encourage you, in fact I beg you, I implore you to read what I have written about the Mosaic Law and its relationship to the Christian. I think it's a fundamental thing. I think if you will do that, it will help us to avoid a lot of needless confusion and in some cases nonsense. Okay, so that's my grandest appeal, is for you to go and do that. And you can do that. If you would go to the website and you click the Bible Studies tab, and under that tab, up comes a set of links, and the two papers that I'm talking about here, a note on the Mosaic Law. It's only like 4 or 5 pages. I mean, I have some up there that are long. These are only like 4 or 5 pages. And one is a note on the Mosaic Law, and the other is the Mosaic Law and the Christian Further Reflections. So if this interests you, if you're saying, what is this guy talking about? Is he out of his mind? Hopefully something there will clarify for you. And then you can email me. You can say, I don't get this. What are you talking about? You're out of your mind. What is this? And we can talk about that way. Okay? I'm happy to do that. I email people all the time. And then the other one is, if you click the Bible Books tab, and then you go under Introduction in Galatians, notes will come up and you can access the notes on the specific sections of Galatians that may be of interest to you in dealing with this subject of the law. At least there you'll get a fuller picture of what I understand, how I think these things, because I think there's just nothing but confusion. And I think it hurts people when they think that the Bible doesn't make sense and I don't understand it. So have a whack, that's all free. All right, so Paul goes back and Paul says, look, beware, he says, beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workmen, beware of the mutilation group. Now, dogs, that was applied by Jews to Gentiles and to lapsed Jews who were ritually unclean and therefore were outside of the covenant. So this is how Jews applied it to Gentiles and to lapsed Jews. They used that term dogs, and Paul then turns the tables. And he applies the very term dogs outside of the covenant. He applies that to the Judaizers. They're the dogs. They're the dogs who stand outside the covenant blessings. And he says here, he describes them as evil workmen. And workmen, it was used not only to designate workers generally, but that term workman was also used to designate Christian workers in the context of missionary activity. And what Paul is doing, he refers to the Judaizers. See, these Judaizing missionaries, these people who kept going around and trying to, well, no, you heard that from Paul, you heard that. No, let me set you straight. Listen, I'm a Jew. We got deep roots. We know how this all works out. Old Testament's ours. They wouldn't call it the Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures. And he comes, okay, we know. So they would go around. And so he says of these Judaizing missionaries, he refers to them, well, they're workmen, all right, just like the Christian people are workmen, the missionaries, but they are evil workmen. That's what they are. And then he says, he calls them the mutilation. Okay, the mutilation, which I added mutilation group just so you understand. But mutilation, that's just a derogatory play on circumcision. That's a derogatory, because they were about, listen, you have to come and submit to the Mosaic law, particularly talking to these Gentiles and saying, no, you have to get circumcised as a sign that you are in fact coming under the entire Mosaic law, and you have to do that to be saved. So this is why they lead with circumcision. This is why circumcision is so significant to them. And so what Paul says here, this idea that he plays off of that, the thing is circumcision, and that was the rite that they insisted was essential for salvation because it's prescribed by the Mosaic law, and coming under the Mosaic law and living that way is essential for salvation. See, so that's what they're doing. And by that reference, Paul identifies the Judaizers. See, by taking this thing about circumcision and cutting off the foreskin and referring to it as the mutilation, he identifies them with the practice of pagan mutilation. You see, pagan mutilation that was forbidden by the law. So he takes it and turns it that way. Circumcision, which was the Judaizers' source of pride. Our allegiance to the Mosaic law. It's interpreted by Paul as a sure sign that they have no part in God's people. And they don't. Because they're heretics. They are dangers to God's people. And then Paul explains why he uses mutilation to refer to the Judaizers. It's Paul, it is the Philippians, and all like them. It is the church, Christian believers, who are the circumcision, meaning the covenant people of God. He's not saying that the Gentiles who are Christians are getting circumcised literally. He's saying they are the circumcision in that we are the true covenant people of God. The Judaizers' claim to that title is false. They claim to be the covenant people of God, the circumcision. They're not. They're the mutilation. That's who they are. They're the mutilation. And then Paul elaborates on qualities of the circumcision, qualities of Christians, of the covenant people of God, implicitly contrasting them to the Judaizers. It is Christians who serve by the Spirit of God. And serve, this word, one of its uses in the Septuagint, one of its uses there denoted service rendered to God by Israel as his special people. Rendered to God by Israel as his special people. So just as the circumcision now applies to the church as God's covenant people, so service of God is now performed by the church. It is performed by the church, and this service in the new age, it is rendered in the power of the Spirit of God. So Paul says there, they serve, and all that's wrapped up in that, by the Spirit of God. He says that it is Christians who glory in Christ Jesus. The new covenant people glory or boast in Christ rather than in their Jewish status or their performance. That is not their hope. That is not what they lean on. It is not who I am and my pedigree and all this stuff. It is Christ. That's who they boast in. Why do you stand? Because of Christ. That's what they do. And then he says, it is Christians who do not have confidence in the flesh. And this is a negative restatement of what he just said rather than a separate and third assertion. It's just a negative restatement of what he just said. They placed no confidence for salvation in national identity or human achievement or any of that. Their confidence for salvation is in Christ. Who he is, what he did. And that's what they're doing. Then Paul says, when it comes to the flesh, though, you see, he says, he takes a back seat to nobody when it comes to the flesh. I made myself a note here. I'm preaching tonight. You have nowhere better to be. 5 o'clock, room 104. Be there, aloha. All right. Now, Paul then goes on and he says in the second part of verse 4 through verse 6, he says, if any other person thinks he has reasons to have confidence in the flesh, I have more. With respect to circumcision, an eighth-day person, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew, born of Hebrews, with regard to the law, a Pharisee, with regard to zeal, persecuting the church, with regard to righteousness rooted in the law, being faultless. So Paul, he draws attention to the fact that he possessed, before his conversion to Christ, even more reason than the Judaizers for placing confidence in the flesh. In other words, he had greater status, greater achievements within Judaism than the Judaizers had. They're coming along saying, basically, take my Jewishness as authoritative and listen to whatever I'm telling you because I'm from the stock and I got this. And Paul says, look, I put them all in the shade. I put them in the shade when it comes to that. And he does this, see, to show that boasting in Christ, not in his Jewish identity and his zeal for the Mosaic law, boasting in Christ is all that mattered. Right? If we're going to go on these things, if we're going to sit here and go on the flesh, I put my resume up. You want to post resumes? I'll put mine up there. And his status within Judaism, his orthodox pedigree and his upbringing. He says with respect to circumcision, well, he was an eighth-dayer. He was an eighth-day person. And you say, well, what in the world is that about? Well, not only was he circumcised, you see, as a sign that he belonged to the covenant people of Israel, but he was circumcised according to God's covenant with Abraham and in strict conformity to the law. And you see how significant eighth day is. You see this idea, this is the ideal, this is what's done, is that you are circumcised on the eighth day. See, he wasn't from a lax Jewish family, right? He wasn't from a lax Jewish family that didn't care to circumcise their son on the eighth day. He wasn't like that. And he wasn't a proselyte from paganism. He didn't come to Judaism after he was older, or then he would have been circumcised then. No. He was circumcised on the eighth day. And then he says, of the stock or the race of Israel. Paul was not a child of proselytes. In other words, you did not have Gentiles who converted to Judaism, who then had a son and then had him circumcised on the eighth day. That wasn't how it was. You see, because he was of the stock or the race of Israel. He was an ethnic Jew. He was an ethnic Jew, having been born of Israelite parents and subsequently circumcised. So he inherited all of the privileges of the covenant community. Paul says that he's of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, the tribe of Benjamin was highly regarded in Israel. It was so because Benjamin was the tribe of Israel's first king, Saul. You see in 1 Samuel 9, 1 and 2. Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David after the disruption of the monarchy. You see that in 1 Kings 12, 21. And the tribe of Benjamin, their territory contained just inside its southern border, or right on the border, the city of Jerusalem. You can see in Joshua 18, 28 and Judges 1, 21. He says that he is a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, a Hebrew son of Hebrew parents. And Hebrew probably refers to Jews who normally spoke Aramaic, while knowing some Greek, they were educated, but who normally spoke Aramaic and who probably attended synagogues where the service was said in Hebrew. These are related languages. So he's speaking of a Hebrew of Hebrews, somebody who spoke Aramaic and attended a synagogue that was delivered where the service of the things were said in Hebrew. So Paul's saying that, look, he spoke Hebrew, as did his parents before him, suggesting that his family, they were strictly observant of the Jewish way of life, and they maintained their links with the home country. He's from Tarsus. But he says, I may be from Tarsus, but I want you to know I'm a Hebrew son of Hebrew parents. We're talking Aramaic. We're going to synagogues where they're talking Hebrew. Now, what do these guys want to, what do they have? They can't come and say to me, what do you know? You know, we were raised there. Paul says, I got it all. I have it all. And then his personal achievements. He says with regard to the law, he's a Pharisee. His approach to the law was that of that sect of Judaism known as Pharisees. And Acts 26:5 refers to the Pharisees as the strictest sect of Judaism. So Paul says, listen, he says, with regard to the law, I'm a Pharisee. He was devoted to obeying not only the Mosaic law, but also the hundreds of commands contained in the oral law. And so the Pharisees were serious about this, you see. They tried by obedience to the law to present the pure community, the true people of God, preparing itself for the coming of the Messiah. Oh, the irony. You see, this is what they're doing. That's why they're so serious about it. And Paul says with regard to zeal, persecuting the church. Zeal for the law, that was an important ideal among many Jews. And his, first bell or second? Okay. And his extreme zeal for the traditions that he had inherited from his forefathers, his ancestors, that zeal was evident in his persecution of the church. You see in Galatians 1:13 and 14, Acts 22:3 and 4. You see, Paul saw at that time, he saw a crucified Messiah as contrary to the law. And so he ferociously sought to stamp out Christianity as some kind of fraudulent teaching, some kind of heresy, because he misunderstood. But that's what drove him. He had great zeal. Then he says, with regard to righteousness that is rooted in the law, being faultless. You see, when it came to righteous living, to living in conformity with the Old Testament as interpreted along Pharisaic lines, he was exemplary. That's how we would put it. He was exemplary. He thus was faultless in the eyes of men. He was faultless from the viewpoint of the flesh. No one could dismiss Paul as not having been devout. No one could argue, you see, that his conversion to Christianity, that it was attributable to prior failure on his part in the Jewish lifestyle. He just was out here, he wanted to party, he was doing... They can't say that about Paul. See, he was as serious and as devout as any of them. Now, that's the sense, you see, that's the sense in which Zacharias and Elizabeth, the parents of John the Baptist, were faultless or blameless. It clearly does not mean sinless. The Spirit of God is not saying through Paul that Paul was sinless. You see, that would be totally foreign to Jewish theology in 2 Chronicles 6:36, Proverbs 20, verse 9, and many other places. It would be totally foreign to Jewish theology. It would be contrary to Paul's statements in Romans about the universality of sin, and it would be contrary to Paul's admission that he coveted prior to his conversion, as you see in Romans chapter 7, verses 7 to 9. Rather, see, part of being blameless, we say, well, what does then is blameless, faultless? Part of being blameless and faultless was offering the prescribed sacrifices when he sinned. As McCown says, Mark McCown, he says, Paul's blamelessness does not imply perfection, but complete fulfillment of the requirements of the Jewish Torah, including its provision to deal with sin, sacrifice, Day of Atonement, etc. You see, so he's somebody who's living devoutly under the Mosaic law. You couldn't go and point to him and say, this guy's no good, this guy's not serious. Paul says, I will put my devotion, my zeal for it, my seriousness toward it against any of you, and dare you to show that I'm not right in doing that. That's what Paul is saying to them. Now, with the coming of Christ, as I said, with the coming of Christ, the obsolescence, and his coming and the obsolescence of the Mosaic covenant and the consequent inapplicability of the Mosaic law, which is part of that covenant, being a devout adherent of the Mosaic law, it ceased to be salvifically relevant. It ceased to be salvifically relevant. What matters in terms of being considered righteous by God is no longer faith expressed in conformity with the Mosaic law, but faith in Christ expressed according to the new covenant. That's what matters. You see, to choose to relate to God as the Judaizers said you had to choose to relate to God under the now obsolete Mosaic covenant, to treat it as binding and not obsolete, leaves one relying on one's obedience rather than God's grace, because the sacrifices for sin that were available under the Mosaic covenant when it was in effect, they are not recognized in light of the perfect and efficacious sacrifice of Christ. That's why Paul said in Galatians 5:4, you who seek to be pronounced righteous by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. You have chosen a graceless option, and that is death. There is only life in Christ. That is God's grace in Jesus Christ. Thanks for coming.